This is the third lecture in our fall faculty lecture series on the university, presented by the Committee on Public Lectures. Tonight we pose a question concerning faculty research. Must we have a policy of publish or perish? Probably the faculty of every PhD granting university would agree on what the answer to that question should be. Yet publish or perish is often regarded as a mysterious practice out of many engaged in by universities, in which the public can become quite aroused. Even legislators and Congress are currently beginning to examine their research granting policies for possible effects on teaching. Here to explain the issues and alternatives is Dr. Foster Sherwood, Vice Chancellor and Professor of Political Science at UCLA. Dr. Sherwood received both his bachelor's and doctor's degree at UCLA and has been on the faculty since 1941. He has served as chairman of the Political Science Department and vice chairman of the Academic Senate and has been vice chancellor since 1960. Dr. Sherwood has received many honors, including the Haynes, Rockefeller, and Fulbright fellowships, during which he studied at London and Oxford. Colgate University has conferred upon him the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws. As Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, it is one of his duties to be overseer of a policy requiring high standards and a proper balance of quality in both teaching and publication. No one can speak with greater authority regarding the policy and practice of the university in this regard. It is my pleasure to present the prime proctor of Publish or Perish, Vice Chancellor Foster Sherwood.
Thank you, Professor Sutton. I suppose the simple thing to do would be to answer the question that is posed in the title of tonight's remarks with a simple yes. We must publish or we perish. But of course, the answer is more complicated than that. And before we can really understand the issues and see the pros and the cons of the problem which the question implicitly poses, we must understand the nature of the argument that is presented by way of criticism of the existing policy of publish or perish. Basically, those who use this phrase, publish or perish, use it as a way of describing what they conceive to be the downgrading of teaching. The argument goes somewhat as follows. The faculty member's success does not depend upon his ability to teach, but on his ability to publish. Thus, he teaches as little as possible, and the good teacher doesn't get promoted. The faculty member is never available for students to talk to, and so they must learn from graduate students. This in turn produces a poor education of ever more narrowing specialties rather than a general education. From this emerges the conclusion that research is the academician's status symbol, the lollipop necessary to bribe him to do the teaching which is indispensably necessary. And from this, in turn, there is produced the further conclusion that one who is good at research is bad at teaching, and vice versa. Now, lest you believe that I have suggested an argument which is of my own construction, let me read to you some quotations. And these texts are taken from recent literature on the subject that range all the way from John Keats's book on modern academic life to Hutchins' articles in the Saturday Review and the Saturday Evening Post. Studies that are designed to reveal the evils existent in the present system. For example, the argument that the professor teaches as little as possible because it is a matter of prestige to avoid the classroom and spend as much time as possible outside it, is supported by a quotation from an administrator at a Midwestern university who is quoted in Keats's book as saying, "The man with the most prestige around here," one professor said, "is one who doesn't teach a soul. He's too busy running around the country giving lectures, writing speeches for the governor, acting as a consultant to private industry or to the Defense Department, or looking for another college to pay him more money. Why do we want him? Because he's good advertising." Or take the question of whether or not good teachers get promoted. This is a quotation from another administrator at another institution. "The only matter of supreme importance," he says, "is whether the teacher knows something about his subject. If a man has this as duly certified by his academic degrees, and if he keeps on proving that he knows something by writing learned papers about his subject, he will have no trouble finding employment and promotion in the professorial ranks, no matter how badly he may communicate what he knows to the student in the classroom." Or, as has been suggested, as a result of this overemphasis upon research, the absenteeism in the classroom is supposed to result in leaving the undergraduate to the tender mercies of the teaching assistant. And so it has been said, "Let's face it," said an undergraduate student at an Eastern institution, "you may have no one but graduate students as your classroom teachers for your first 2 years." So this is the case that is made against Publish or Perish: that it produces bad teaching, that it reflects an overemphasis upon research, that it removes the instructor from contact with its students, and that the resultant product is a bad education, not a general education, and that research becomes completely divorced from the classroom. Research is simply the academician's lollipop. Now, as a result of this case made, there have been a number of suggestions for reform. We have no lack of such suggestions, but the ones most often proposed and most strenuously urged include some of the following. First of all, it is suggested we should promote solely upon the basis of the quality of the job of teaching done by the classroom instructor. Now, it is admitted by those who propose this that the measurement of the quality of teaching is a very difficult task. But it is suggested these difficulties tend to melt away if you examine the verdicts of those who are the direct consumers of the teacher's product, that is to say, the students. Ask the students how good the instructor is, and rely upon the student's verdict in judging the quality of instruction within the classroom, both with respect to appointment and promotion. Then it is proposed, additionally, that one should eliminate from the curriculum all but liberal arts courses for undergraduates. Avoid the evils of over-specialization. Avoid the evils of an emphasis upon the study of subjects in depth. Rather seek for breadth in one's education. and attempt to cover subjects rather than to penetrate them. Then it is suggested that the faculty should be made available for students in small groups to talk with. I recall just the other day reading in the Bruin notice of the happy event that some 7 students were caught in an elevator in the social science building with an instructor for an hour while the elevator was stuck between floors. This was represented as kind of an interesting and valuable contact between the students and faculty, as if the only time it could possibly happen was when, as is all too frequently the case, I regret to say, the elevators in the social science building stalled. Then it is suggested that another attack on this problem is to train graduate students to teach their subjects rather than to research their specializations. And there have been serious proposals made in various parts of the country, including this campus, that there be developed a series of degrees attesting to the competence of a graduate student to teach the subject rather than to test his ability to manage original data in original ways. The so-called teaching degree, which has been tried in 1 or 2 places. But before we analyze these solutions and attempt to understand their practicality, it might be useful for us to give some attention to the question of what is meant by research and what function research performs in a university setting, so that we may estimate the appropriateness of some of the solutions that have been proposed for this problem of publish or perish. What is research? Does it lead to useless specialization, ever narrower concentrations upon ever more esoteric subjects, the fragmentation of education and of learning, classroom absenteeism? What is research? Well, first of all, I would argue that research is a part of the teaching function. It is the responsibility of a university, which has the obligation to deal with the universe of knowledge, to teach, and to teach in all forms and all clientele. We teach undergraduates in the classroom. We teach graduate students in our offices and our laboratories, and we teach our peers by what we write and what we communicate to them by way of our interests and our discoveries that we believe will be of value to them. Teaching includes research. It is not antithetical to research. Research is a part of the teaching function. But more than that, research performs certain essential functions that teaching alone cannot perform. First of all, one's ability to communicate with one's peers on a level of communication which implies a contribution to the sum total of the known is a measure of intellectual vitality. It is true that those who teach may also, and usually do, in a university environment, exhibit intellectual vitality. But the record of research is a record of vitality, a permanent, recorded series of contributions, which recorded series of contributions show the growth of the author and his ability to encompass and to deal with his information on an ever more sophisticated level. Furthermore, we are beginning to discover some things about the teaching function that we never knew before. we discover more often than not that research ability and teaching ability go hand in hand. Last year, a committee of this faculty set out to attempt to identify the principal gifted teachers on this campus. And they went about it in the following way. They asked graduating seniors who had no interest to be served by their answers to identify the 3 most gifted teachers that they had had in their 4 undergraduate years. These names were then collected, and the names thus appearing on that list were compared with those who had research records of distinction. And it was found, more often than not, that those with significant contributions which they had made in the area of research were the individuals on the list of the most gifted teachers. One of the measures of teaching success and competence, in other words, is research performance. This is something which has acted as kind of a surprise in many circles, among many people who have not thought through the problem very thoroughly, I suggest. For one thing, of course, research represents a commitment to a field, to a subject matter, to a discipline. It represents a conviction that the universe, if you like, centers about that field, that specialty, that discipline. That one's ability to master the intricacies of the problems which that discipline represents is among, if not the most important function which society looks to have performed. One who has this kind of dedication will be able to communicate it to his students. There will be nothing routine about his teaching, nothing traditional about his approach to his discipline. This kind of dedication is found only among the very young, to whom the whole discipline is novel, and among the seniors who have been in the habit of reshaping their discipline, who have the excitement of contribution to communicate to their students. One of the things that we presume an education is all about is not to teach psychology, not to teach mathematics, not to teach chemistry or political science, but rather to teach how a psychologist thinks, how a chemist deals with a problem, how a mathematician operates. These attitudes, these habits of mind, these techniques of dealing with information represent far and away the most important component of an education. And it is only through the contribution which research makes that the teacher is enabled to communicate over a period of time this kind of excitement which he himself continues to feel for his subject. I regret to say, I know a member of this faculty who, having been a member of this faculty for some 35 years, is still teaching from the same notes that he took as a graduate student 35 years ago. The very sheets of paper have remained unchanged. They are now so worn and brittle that the corners have rounded through usage. 35 years ago, even 30 years ago, the students were up in arms at any suggestion that any of his terribly radical remarks might be the subject of criticism. The most important and the most vital and the most exciting teacher on our faculty was purported to be this man. Today, his ideas are old hat. They're the ideas of 35 years ago. His discipline has marched far beyond where he is, and students stay away in droves This tells us something about the function of research. In his record, I can recall but 2 book reviews in 35 years. The function of research is a measurement of intellectual vitality, and its quality frequently, in fact, usually parallels the quality of his teaching. Research also has many forms, just as university disciplines assume many forms. Research is the submission of one's creative product to the judgment of one's peers, whatever is appropriate to the discipline involved. It may take the form of published articles. It may take the form of a painting hung in an exhibition. It may take the form of a musical composition. It may take the form of a structure designed by the engineer and put before the public in a novel way or to perform a novel function. There are essentially as many forms of research as there are forms of creativity. And incidentally, it is the word creativity that is used as the criterion of measurement of the quality of a member of this faculty, both with respect to his appointment and to his promotion. We may also, I suggest, look upon specialization with a somewhat more intelligent view if we do not regard it as simply the ever narrowing of interest, but rather the broadening of interest. Specialization within a discipline may often and does really constitute a broadening of the discipline. There are historians, for example, who are concerned with only a narrow period of time in which to specialize in their study of history. There are scientists who are also concerned with the same period of time in the history of science. There are those who are concerned with literary studies, confined to a short period of time. The gathering together of these individuals in a group designed to understand the totality of that period of time, the medieval period, the Renaissance period, the ancient historical period, whatever it might be, represents a specialization. It also represents, I would suggest, a broadening of interest. For the historian or the scientist or the student of literature or the student of language, in seeking to understand his specialization, must be ever more aware of the penumbral disciplines which surround his discipline, prepared to penetrate and to seek help and guidance from those trained in the methodologies of kindred disciplines, to seek out a more fundamental understanding of language or literature or science or whatever it may be. And thus, in recent years, we have collected together these narrow specialists in groups, and we call these groups institutes or centers of medieval studies, of molecular biology, of geophysics. We have a dozen of these groups which represent not narrow specializations, but broadening out of disciplines, the expansion of specializations, the cross-fertilization of disciplines, by bringing to established modes of study and established fields of effort those dedicated to other fields of effort who have something to contribute to the new nexus of an academic discipline. Space science, urban studies, geophysics, these are but words, terms designed to encompass groups of specialists dedicated to the investigation of problems which, from the point of view of their traditional discipline, have been narrow specialties, but which, in these new contexts, become very broad concerns with very human and very practical matters. We must also realize that wherever we start in the examination of the universe about us, whatever happens to catch our eye, so to speak, whatever interests us and arouses our curiosity, is but a beginning point in answering our curiosity. For every question that we can devise the answer to, we simultaneously devise another dozen questions that require answers even more urgently than those we have already answered. The march of modern science is not the putting finis to a series of discrete questions posed at some time in the past, but rather the discovery of new questions which we must ask our data, new questions that become answerable, new questions that demand answers. And as we move from our narrow specialty, as we move from our concentration upon an event, upon a human being, or upon a bit of discrete, measurable phenomena, to its understanding, we must understand not only that event, not only that phenomena, not only that human being, but all of the surrounding data, if we are to answer the question we originally posed. And each bit of surrounding data in turn has its penumbra with its questions and its technique and its urgency. It makes no difference where research starts. It has as its field the universe of human knowledge. Well then, let us go back to our original set of propositions, our original set of criticisms, and attempt to answer the questions which those solutions pose. First of all, can we measure teaching directly? Yes, we can. And to some degree we do. And we are making ever more refined efforts to do so. We've discovered a number of things about the teaching function. One of them I've already mentioned, that somehow or other there is a correspondence over time between the teaching function at the undergraduate level and the research function. We can take as a rough index of teaching capacity research performance, qualitatively measured. But we can also verify our judgments by an examination of what students have to say about their teachers. Now, in this regard, we have to be careful to safeguard ourselves against popularity contests, against questionnaires or public opinion polls that are tilted in one way or another, distorted from the essential ingredient of good teaching, which is the ability to arouse the curiosity in the student that will lead the student to seek to satisfy that curiosity by his own efforts. So we need to examine the opinions of students and to weigh as well as count them, to concern ourselves perhaps more with the bright student than with the not so bright student's opinion. Thus, for example, we may be concerned to discover what kind of students this hypothetical instructor attracts to him. What happens to those students after they leave him? Do they go on to greater academic glories? Do they do well in the next course, which requires our hypothetical instructor's course as a prerequisite? Or if a graduate student, when they leave this campus, do they go on to distinction in their chosen field? Or do they represent but a mediocre member of their professional group? This will tell us something about the quality of instruction. We also have discovered that those who teach well like to teach. Thus, the good instructor will more often than not be found to be spending more than the minimum amount of time in the classroom. Most of us, enjoy doing what we do well, or what we think we do well. And if we like to teach, if we think we do it well, we will enjoy doing it, and we will tend to do more of it than those who somehow or other feel that they're not at their best in the classroom situation. So a rough index of the good teacher is the teacher who teaches a lot, too. So these indices give us some clue to the quality of instruction. And these are indices that we seek out and that we deal with in appointment and promotion matters. Then we want to know something about how this individual fits in with the average. Well, at UCLA and in most of the Big Ten institutions in this country, recent surveys have indicated that slightly over the half of the faculty members' time is devoted to teaching and those activities directly associated with teaching. Academic counseling of students and the like. Some 54% of a faculty member's time is devoted to teaching at UCLA and at other major universities in the United States. Doesn't sound much like class absenteeism, as the charge would have it. Then let's ask the question, can the instructor be made more available to his students? Well, before we can answer this, we must know how available he is to his students. The notion which the general public is fed is of a class of thousands, presided over by an instructor more often absent than present, and usually managed by a teaching assistant who is perhaps only a year or two better prepared than the students with whom he is dealing. Is this the situation that exists? Statistics show that some 44% of all classes offered at UCLA are classes with enrollments of less than 20. Let me repeat that. Almost half of all the classes offered at UCLA are classes of less than 20. Those classes with enrollments of 21 to 50 represent another 41% of all the classes offered at UCLA. So some 85% of all the classes offered at UCLA in any week have enrollments of 50 or less. Now, this is not a bad record. But the way in which the university is able to afford this kind of an arrangement is by a few very large classes at the freshman and sophomore level, which may involve the enrollment of hundreds. But this is an economic fact of life. And I would suggest to you that it is far better to be in a class of 500 taught by an able man than to be in a class of 20 taught by a fool. And sometimes the choice may be just that. But we afford, both in terms of the numbers of faculty and in terms of the time of our faculty, the small class by the large one. We afford this because we are able to average out in terms which meet the financial resources of the state of California. Now, the charge that the only time that you get to see a member of the faculty is when you get stalled in an elevator in the social science building overlooks certain facts. I've been here for quite a while, and ever since I came to UCLA, I can remember the constant urgings of various students for better contacts with the faculty. These urgings took periodically the form of various schemes to bring the faculty and the students closer together. I've lived through a good many of these, and I see many in the audience who lived through the same ones that I have. I've never found my office hour crowded. And when the students have proposed a coffee hour, I used to go to those coffee hours, and I met many of my colleagues there, but I met very few students there. We hear a good deal today about the importance of contact between the students and the faculty. And almost in the same breath, we hear a good deal of insistence upon the right to engage in individual study, independent study, study that consists of a minimum of student-faculty contact. I'm not just sure what this argument is intended to prove. Then finally, I would enter a word of defense for the much maligned teaching assistant. The teaching assistant is not all that bad. I was once a teaching assistant, and as I look back on it, I think the university got more value for its dollar in those days than it ever has since from me. Certainly, I was conscientious, I was dedicated, I was excited by my subject, and I was a real missionary, anxious to convince every one of my students of the importance of my subject, and utterly refusing to accept the fact that they might not be convertible. This is a characteristic of many of our teaching assistants. In fact, this survey I referred to a moment ago, in which honor graduates were asked to identify the best teachers they had as undergraduates, turned up with surprising and sometimes distressing frequency the names of teaching assistants as the most exciting instructors they had as undergraduates. Yet I can understand this, and I believe it to be true. For quite apart from whatever other virtues the teaching assistant had or might lack, at his stage of intellectual development, he must be dedicated. He wouldn't hold down that kind of a job if he weren't. And he must be excited by his discipline. It's still too new. And that excitement must somehow or other be communicable to his students. Further, the teaching assistant is not all that bad because the teaching assistant may be only a few weeks, a few months, a year away from his degree. And I'm not at all sure that a degree as an act makes a teacher that much better. The process of achieving the position of a member of the faculty in a university with responsibility for teaching young people is a process that goes on by imperceptible degrees over a long period of time. At some point in that time, somebody or some group of people come along and say he has progressed far enough to have conferred on him the formal license of accomplishment. But it is not something that he lacks the day before that happens and possesses the day after. It is a maturation process which by no means is complete on the day he receives his degree, and is by no means incomplete or non-existent the day before. So teaching assistants don't do a bad job. And some of our best teaching is at the hands of teaching assistants. Then let me suggest that much of this argument is based upon the premise that the only educational experience that goes on in a collegiate career is what goes on in the classroom. And that if you don't get your education in the 50 minutes of the lecture hour, heaven help you, you never will. I would suggest that this is not so either. That the educational process outside the classroom is quite as important as what goes on inside. Recently, a Reed College junior, Reed College is an institution noted for the high quality of its teaching, was heard to remark, "The people you meet in college offer you far more of an education than the professor you meet or the courses you take." Temple University senior writes, "You know why the Ivy schools are better than this place? It's because the kids who go there are brighter than we are. The education is better." Students make an education too. They have a great deal to do with the quality of the educational experience that they experience from one another. And a good deal of this goes on outside the classroom. It has been traditional in some parts of the world, for example, for the education to be defined in just those terms. I think it was Cardinal Cushing who someplace wrote that if he had to choose between attending class and living in a dormitory to get an education, he'd live in the dormitory because he'd get an education faster. Stephen Leacock someplace has written that if he had all the money necessary to found a college, the first thing he'd do would be to build a smoking room. Then he'd build a commons. Then he'd build a library. Then if he had any money left over, he might hire a professor. Well, he's entitled to exaggerate his point to make it, but the point is a valid point, and that is that a great deal of education goes on outside the classroom. It goes on in the exchange, debate, discussion, bull session environment. This is why a residential education is better than a commuter education, other things being equal. This is why a full-time education is better than a part-time one, other things being equal. Well, let's go back then and take a look at the solutions that we identified as among those proposed. Evaluate teaching only. Ask the students their verdict. Yes. Not only, but evaluate teaching too. And one of the evaluations of teaching is the ability of the subject to teach his peers as well as his followers. Eliminate all but liberal arts courses and thus avoid over-specialization? No, because specialization depends entirely upon where you stand. My broad-gauged education is your specialization. And your special interest, which is so narrow as to be meaningless, is to you a broad educational background. Any man worth his salt is convinced that his discipline is the center of the universe, is the most important subject, the most broad-gauged and most seminal subject of any that the mind of man has been able to evolve. Make the faculty available to students in small numbers? Yes. where that contact is useful and where both the students and the faculty seek out those opportunities and find them mutually profitable. Because remember, not only do students learn from students, but the faculty learns from students too. And one of the most important lures that we have when we seek to recruit a member of our faculty is the quality of our student body. It's worth thousands of dollars per year in salary. The quality of our student body. Because a man who has a new idea, a new method of dealing with the subject, and who has an opportunity to try it out on lively undergraduates before he rushes into print and makes a part of that permanent record that may serve to dog him for the rest of his life, a man who tries to test it on bright undergraduates who are inspired and excited by his effort to deal with his material and at the sight of him dealing with it. That opportunity is an opportunity the value of which the intelligent academician does not underrate. It's among the most important virtues that is sought by any potential faculty member in making up his mind whether or not to join a faculty. What kind of students do they have? Train graduate students to teach their subjects, not to research their specialties. Give them a teaching degree on the basis of their ability to deal with subjects in the large, rather than their ability to contribute to a specialty. It's been tried. Trouble is, nobody wants the product of the teaching degree. Because the product of the teaching degree is superficial. His excitement doesn't last long. After a few years, one finds that he's lost the dedication. And when we are talking about appointment and promotion to a faculty, we're talking about a 30-year career or more. And we want to be just as sure that at the end of that career, the individual has as much vitality intellectually, as much dedication, as much excitement in his mastery of his subject as he has at the beginning of his career. But if he is trained to be superficial, if he's trained to master a body of subject matter without contributing to it, he will never retain that vitality. What is the purpose, then, of an education? I think most of the lectures in this series raise this problem explicitly or implicitly, and it's a problem with which we all live, and I certainly am not going to try to answer it tonight. There have been several answers that have been suggested by men far wiser than I. An education is designed to prepare students for life, or an education is designed to equip a student to approach his surroundings with a cautious optimism that most problems are soluble through reason guided by experience, or to provide a student with a set of values and attitudes with which survival on more than a physical plane is possible. These are three. I could multiply these by 10. I don't know what the proper solution is, and I suppose any of them would do, with the appropriate definitions, qualifications, and footnotes. I do know this, however, that life's problems and their solutions are never at rest, never complete. Thus, what must be done is to inculcate a curiosity about the world as it touches us, and a dedication to attempting to satisfy that curiosity. It is only through teaching research, hyphenate, only through teaching research that this can be done. And it's through a dedication to the advancement of one's own chosen discipline in terms designed to excite and arouse curiosity that one can do this. This is reasonable, then it requires research, and it requires the ability to communicate the product of that research with an excitement, with a dedication, with a desire to convert, with a missionary zeal, if you like. That's a university. Thank you. Yes. Publication is simply the way in which research receives the attention that it requires if it is to be evaluated. Now, not all publications are equally valid measures of the quality of the content. I remember some years ago, in 1 week, I was put on 2 promotion committees as a member of the faculty designed to examine the evidence. And in one committee, the record came with some 26 items of bibliography. The other committee, there were 4 items of published research. A more careful examination indicated that the 26 items were all based upon one laboratory experiment which had been run by the subject when he was a graduate student. He was still writing up that experiment. The 4 items were on quite related, but by no means identical information. The first man with the 26 items was not promoted. The second man was. The problem of judging research is not a problem of quantitative judgment. And don't let anybody suggest that it is simply counting. It is not. It's a qualitative judgment as to the impact that the man has had upon the knowledge in his field. Sometimes I've had occasion to put the question this way: if this man had never lived, would his discipline have been any different? If the answer is no, we don't want him. If the answer is yes, how different? What has he done for his field? Something that can be identified, that can be looked at, estimated, valued, not just by me or just by his colleagues on this campus, but identified and measured and valued by members of his field. This is what is meant by publish. All articles are not born free and equal. Yes. Yes. No. I do not. I have reference only to classes, organized classes listed in the schedule of classes, meeting at discrete and fixed times under the instruction of a named instructor. You've asked several questions. Let me try and deal with them. First of all, the question of whether freshmen should be entitled to access to the faculty member in small groups. This would be ideal if we had unlimited funds and we could homogenize out this statistical array that I've given you in such a way that the average class and the modal class on this campus might be 100 students, which would mean that no one would get access to any member of the faculty at any level of his education, given our present financial resources. We have that alternative, or we have the alternative of doing what we do, which is to attempt to offer every student in his undergraduate career as many opportunities for small class instruction as possible, but also force students in their undergraduate careers to subject themselves to quite a different kind of experience, the experience of a student in a very large class. I don't think this is entirely bad. I suppose most of us have the romantic notion that a college ought to be a collection of 100 faculty members and about 400 students located in a small college town surrounded by a farming community in which everybody lives in everyone else's hip pocket, and life doesn't really need to be faced until after graduation, if then. But if education is for life, if it's supposed to prepare one for life, I don't know where you're going to go when you graduate from an institution of that kind. How many of our graduates are going to small towns to live in small communities, to depend upon family and other relationships for their livelihood and for their social life and for their intellectual stimulation? Most of the products of our universities are going into large urban centers where they're going to sink or swim just pretty much on their own, and where their ability to get through a large urban university is one of the first opportunities they have to learn how it's going to be. Very, very few people, and in every generation it's fewer, have an opportunity to opt for the small town existence. We might all like to live there, but here we all are in megalopolis. Now, your second question concerned the question of whether or not, could you state it again? Yes. 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 Question of more depends upon what the present situation is, does it not? At the moment, any member of the faculty is encouraged to distribute to his students questionnaires designed to evaluate his teaching performance in any class for which he holds academic responsibility. The questionnaires that he may use are questionnaires supplied by the students themselves at no cost to him or his department, or questionnaires devised by him or by his department, or questionnaires supplied by extramural agencies that are concerned with the evaluation of teaching. Now, most of those who have looked at this problem of student evaluation of teaching have reached certain conclusions. One is that a properly drawn questionnaire is of primary value to the instructor in telling him what he needs to do about his teaching in order to improve it. It's only of secondary value to others. Now, 2 years ago, the students printed some 5,000 copies of their student questionnaire. This year, they came to me for some financial help in order to print enough copies to go round. They're printing 50,000 copies this year, and they expect them all to be used. And I'm sure they're right, and they'll be back to print more. So there's a good deal of student evaluation going on. But the student evaluation to be effective is not whether this man is a good teacher or a bad teacher, but rather in terms of the sorts of things that he does that represent to students good teaching and bad teaching. Last year, one of the schools on this campus ran an experiment. I don't know what it shows, but it's worth reporting in this context. They selected 2 members of their faculty, one who was noted for his lucidity and for his technique, the other of whom was generally regarded to be one of the most confusing human beings it had ever been anyone's misfortune to know. They were each assigned a section of a course in a cumulative structure of learning. The students that they were assigned on an arbitrary basis, but designed to ensure that neither instructor had a better group, a more able group of students than the other. At the end of the semester, they took a common final exam. Which students did better? The students who were being taught by the man who was a bad teacher. They were good enough students that they recognized that if they were to master the material, and they had to in order to move on in their discipline, they'd have to master it on their own, and by mastering it on their own, they really learned it. This comes back to my earlier point that good students are the most important instructors we have around here. You don't cut them in half. That is exactly the burden of all of my remarks this evening. You don't cut them in half. They cannot teach without doing research. They are teaching when they do research, and research is a part of the teaching function. I don't know why they would be fearful. In 20 years of holding office hours, I never had an office hour fully occupied by students. Never in 20 years. Now, you can talk about the small college and its dedication to teaching, but to the exclusion of research. But maybe you noticed the inaugural address of the new president of Occidental last week, in which he said his faculty have to dedicate themselves to working on the edge of knowledge if they're to stay alive in a world in which their disciplines are changing overnight. They've got to work on the edge of knowledge. This means research, doesn't it? Engineering school has told us that students whom they are producing today will know an awful lot of what isn't so 20 years from now and maybe 10 years from now. And I don't think this is confined to engineering. I don't know a discipline which hasn't changed and changed vastly in the last generation, in the last decade, in the last half-decade. We're told that 90% plus of all the published literature in the biological sciences has appeared since the end of World War II. One of the biggest problems that faces us today is how to manage this knowledge explosion. But in managing the knowledge explosion, the one thing we must not lose sight of is the ability to add to it, the intellectual curiosity, without which it would not have taken place and without which it will produce no offspring. You can't divide an academician's life into teaching and research. There's no point in faculty member's life when he says, well, so much for research now, I'll get ready for my classes tomorrow. It just doesn't happen that way. Today's research problem in the laboratory becomes part of the lecture tomorrow or day after or next month. In no preconceived way, but depending upon how it fits, what it is, and where it takes place. And my contribution becomes a part of someone else's lecture. If I communicate it to someone else, not otherwise. If I don't, then you have the vision of thousands of people all over the world engaging in the same experiment, more or less, producing the same result, more or less, at tremendous waste of energy and very little progress. We find ourselves walking in our own footsteps. Too much of this goes on already because of the difficulty of managing information. But if we don't communicate it, the difficulty becomes many times confounded. We're told, for example, that the discovery of insulin was a rediscovery. That the actual scientific basis for the treatment of diabetes could have been made available to humanity a generation before it was. But it was through a lack of communication. The research had been done. It does no good to get the bright idea to talk to one or two people about it and to leave no impress, to make no effort to communicate this to others who may use it as a basis for further investigation and further study. Publish? Yeah. When appropriate to the discipline. But remember, the artist publishes when he hangs his painting in the gallery. The composer publishes when the composition is played by the orchestra. Publishing takes many forms, but it subjects the result of investigation and intellectual effort to the judgment of one's peers. Now, the content of what is produced can only be judged by one's peers, not by freshmen. The form in which it is presented may be judged by freshmen. But those two things must not be confused. They're separate things. That, of course, will depend upon the student. My figure was not based upon what the faculty does. The figure was based upon what the classes are. Now, in the first 2 years, for one thing, the student will take all of his foreign language in small classes. He may also, in his first 2 years, depending upon the extent of his preparation, take courses in his major in small classes. As he progresses from freshman to sophomore, sophomore to junior, and junior to senior, the amount of time that he spends in the small class will increase. But there's nothing magic about the small class. As I suggested earlier, I would believe that it is better to be a member of a class of 500 with a gifted instructor than a member of a class of 20 with a fool. And in this day and age, there aren't that many gifted instructors. All right. Yeah. Most are. Most are of that size in the first 2 years, and that's the way in which we afford classes of the 20 or less in the last 2 years. Now, we could provide small classes in the first 2 years, small classes of 50, say, which would mean that no class would be below 50 in the whole of the 4-year period. It's an economic question, as well as a pedagogical one. You can have some large and some small, or all medium-sized. Beyond a certain point, I think the size of a class doesn't make much difference. I don't really think it makes much difference whether a class has 150 in it or 500. I think it makes a good deal of difference whether it has 20 or 150. But the number of 20-size classes we have is necessarily limited. Believe me, the university is not attempting to create large classes because it believes in the large class. We are not sitting on piles of resources with which we could hire large numbers of available instructors to create classes of 20 for all students all throughout the 4 years. We have these practical alternatives. We can create some small classes if we create some large ones. It seems logical and reasonable that as a student progresses and shows his ability to deal with a subject matter, that the classes be made progressively smaller. For this reason, we have most of our small classes in the upper division and most of our large classes in the lower division. But to both, there are notable exceptions. Yes, sir. I think extremely well. I think extremely well. Yes. And more than that, I'd say the majority of this faculty are excellent teachers. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that the one man who doesn't do well with a class, for whatever reason, is an object of notoriety. But the man who does well with a class is taken for granted. There's a lot of excellent teaching in this institution. If there weren't, why don't students go to the state colleges, where the faculties are chosen exclusively on the basis of their teaching competence? They come here. Why? I assume because they are qualified and they get more out of the experience. There's nothing to prevent them from going elsewhere, but they come here. I think we produce a very high level of teaching. And the reason we do is because we produce a very high level of research. I didn't make that judgment. I report the result of a survey. Yes, it is true that to a certain degree the result was built in. But I would also be perfectly prepared to measure that result against a comparable survey run at any other institution of different character and abide by the result. No, I'm sorry, that is not so. That is not so. The questionnaire that was circulated not only here, but in 10 other institutions of comparable size all over the United States, and the definitions were uniform, and the variation in the results were less than 2%, which indicates that the questions were reasonably well uniformly understood, and the results were reasonably objective. But if you cannot draw the line between research and teaching, how can you argue that too much research is going on? What is the difficult one? How much is so much? But I just got through indicating that this faculty does not devote that much time to research. I'm afraid it did not. Some do. Some do. And some do not. Every year, I see in the case of every member of this faculty exactly how many classes he taught last year, or how many instruction hours per week, and how many students were enrolled in them. I don't need samples. I see every one. I have done that too. And the evidence is present. It is examined every year. I know a good deal more about it than anyone else in this room. Exactly what the class contact hour workload of this faculty is, individual by individual, department by department. Yes, it varies widely. But the average is highly respectable. And I would compare, for example, our class absenteeism on the part of the faculty with that of any other institution in the United States, including the state colleges, about which I know a little. Yes, sir. No. The categories under which the individual was asked to present his information were teaching, that is, classroom hours plus preparation directly related to the holding of a particular class. A separate heading was committees and other activities on campus. This, incidentally, was done for the state colleges, the junior colleges, and the university. And the proportions were what common sense would tell you they would be. That is to say, the proportion of the time spent in research was less in the state colleges than in the university, was approaching zero in the junior colleges. But the difference in time spent in teaching was not the same. In the state colleges and the junior colleges, the proportion of time spent in preparation for class and in class was very little more than that in the university. The difference was in public service. Yes. The other 46% consisted of research plus university service plus community service. University service being departmental duties, committee work and the like, community service being whatever is appropriate in the discipline by way of serving the community. Anything from serving on as commander of the Boy Scout troop to consulting with a firm of practicing engineers. Yes, sir. Yes, yes, a good deal of change. I should indicate that contrary to popular belief, the criteria for appointment and promotion in this faculty are not the foul creation of a group of secretive administrators, but are rather the results of the judgment of the faculty. And the criteria have been refined in the last 10 years 3 times, to my recollection, in rather substantial ways designed to provide more explicit guidance in determining the existence of creativity. One of the things that is not known and which does not fit the kind of arguments that are made against the existing system is that there are many members of this faculty who have not been promoted because of bad teaching. This has happened. There have been some members of this faculty who have been promoted because of good teaching without a research record. This too has happened. The essential quality of mind that is sought for in every case is this intellectual vitality. It does not always appear in conjunction with a research record. And the volume of research is not the criterion in any event. It's the quality. Yes. What makes a good teacher is only partly unknown. Some of the things we know. For one thing, a research record makes a good teacher in many disciplines. For another, exactly, a good research record. Now, we do not depend upon the estimate of the individual concerned in evaluating his research record. We ask his peers. Yes. We ask them what he has contributed to his discipline from their point of view. And we rely very heavily upon what we get back from them if their answers are circumstantial. If they're more than just he's a good man and, gee, he's ought to be promoted. that isn't taken very seriously. But if the reply is, this is what he's done, and this is how important it is, then we have something to go on. And we do that in every case. I'll tell you right now, I made it. Nothing secret about it. Anytime.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
You seem to equate good teaching with promotion. Compare it to equate bad teaching with listening.
Yes. Bad teaching has resulted in dismissal. Of course, in the university system that prevails in the United States, there is such a thing as tenure. And one who has achieved tenure in bygone days before the present enlightened administration were able to deal with these questions, the most one can do is to refuse promotion. No, I don't mean to suggest that that the system works without error. I've made some mistakes. I've made some buttes, some real beauties, both affirmative and negative. And I recognize them, and I'm sorry for them. And I'm going to have to live with some of them for a great many years to come, which is the cross I bear and the risk I take. But Goethe somewhere has written that he who would act will be unjust. And one must act.